Brilliant. So, Luca, welcome. Thank you very much for making the time to meet with me today. It's always lovely to have a chat with you, and I know how busy you are, so I do appreciate you being here. I'd like to just open up this conversation by going back to the very beginning. You joined the University of Heidelberg in 1991 to study law, and then you went on to join SAP as a legal intern in 1996. What motivated you to pursue that line of education, and what then attracted you to the tech sector and SAP specifically?
First of all, Leo, thanks for having me. And actually, you more come across as the CFO today, and I come across as the student with my hoodie here. Well, actually, honestly speaking, studying law was not necessarily a decision of my heart, because as a high school kid, I was very attracted by history, especially ancient history, Roman history. And so I had plans to become an archaeologist, but then I figured that that would probably not mean kind of jumping around like Indiana Jones and having great adventures, but rather sitting in a dusted library and doing desktop research. So I was questioning myself a bit what could be a good choice. And the irony is, while I was, I would say, a decent student at maths, I was not stellar. One of my sons is much better at that today. But I was always good at languages, arguing my case, social sciences, and so on. And so I decided that law is probably a good place to start from. And I ended up as I would say, a pretty good law student. Had quite a good result in my final exams. So my original plan was then to, finish my second legal state exam that you have to go through in Germany, working at different courts, and then starting at one of the Ivory League law firms, Freshfields or Sherman or whoever else comes to mind. But I had to bridge 6 months between the end of my studies and the beginning of my work at the different courts. And in order to not just hang around, I actually decided to do an internship at this small software company that was around the corner from where I lived in Waldorf, and that happened to be SAP. I did not mean to stay there originally, but when I joined, I got really excited about how flat the hierarchies were back then at SAP. It was a company of around about 10,000 employees, so by far not yet the global juggernaut that it is today. But as a result of that, the three folks that they had back then in the legal department were really desperate and were turning to me for a lot of serious work during those 6 months. That inspired me a lot because they gave this young kid, barely done with the legal education, really serious assignments and complex stuff that I had to work myself into. I was fully accepted as a member not only of the team, but actually also as the legal partner to the business folks that were approaching me for support, sometimes not even knowing that I was just an intern. And as a result of that, I really was able to learn a lot. And at the end of these 6 months, actually, the general counsel of SAP presented me with a signed employment contract from SAP with a start date 2 years later, because I still had to finalize my different court stages. And I signed on the spot because I felt, okay, a company that is as entrepreneurial in nature as to give this young guy a chance, a shot, without even knowing what would happen 2 years from now, was exactly the environment that I wanted to be in. Now, I knew at that point that this decision would mean that I would not stay in law forever, because if you want to just be the best attorney with the most complex assignments, I think you best do that in one of the law firms where you're constantly presented with serious legal assignments. I was more attracted by the opportunity to learn in a more broad fashion about how businesses work, but I could see the legal department as a good springboard from which to then expand into different forays. That's how I ultimately then came around in different other places, risk management, core finance, to ultimately make my way to becoming a CFO. And that's perhaps the other thing that I've always been excited about, that at SAP, yes, you were joining the company in a certain function, but the structures were fluid. And as long as you were interested and eager and asking for more work, so to say, you would always get a chance to prove yourself in different other capacities. That's how you learn and that's how you grow. And I think that has also ultimately made the company so successful. And so I've never regretted that move back then. But I'm also, I have to say, equally glad that I didn't end up purely in the legal capacity, but had a chance to learn about different subjects, ultimately doing also an MBA later in my career.
So can we dive back into that initial period when you joined SAP? Because obviously 1996 marks quite a major period in tech, being the beginning of the dot-com bubble. But by 2000, that bubble burst, and many of SAP's competitors, from JD Edwards to Cyber Systems, they didn't weather that storm. SAP did. They doubled down on their core ERP market, but also invested in long-term strategy by developing various innovative products like mysap.com. And so from your perspective, were there specific lessons that you learned during that period that influenced your leadership style and the way in which you approach crisis today?
That's an interesting question. I have to say, when the dot-com bubble burst, I was obviously early on in my career, so I didn't have the full weight of responsibility on my shoulders yet that I had perhaps in the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, where I was already a proper CFO for one of our largest markets in Germany. I will give you a quick answer for the dot-com question, and then perhaps the more meaningful conversation is around the financial crisis in terms of my own personal learnings. I think from an institutional perspective, what SAP had at its advantage was back then a leadership that was still grounded in a founder's philosophy, right? Hasso Plattner, one of the founders of SAP, was still around during the crisis. Dietmar Hopp, the other co-founder of SAP, had already left but was still on the supervisory board. And so they always had a philosophy to lean into difficult circumstances and find it as a springboard to reinvent the company. That, I think, was super important. And at the same time, the business model was probably a bit stickier than the one of many of the other and smaller firms. SAP had already, by the year 2000, a very broad customer base of very sophisticated large enterprises, which gave a certain stability to the firm. And ripping and replacing or reducing an ERP estate is perhaps also less easy to do than if you have a small piece of whatever procurement on-ramp solution like an Ariba, for example, which ultimately ended up then as an SAP business and subsidiary and was acquired by them later on, or some of the smaller ERP competitors that did not have this breadth of a customer base and were then later mostly gobbled up by Oracle, the key competitor and nemesis of SAP in that respect. So I would say it was a combination of having kind of an entrepreneurial approach towards crisis management, and then also better foundational prerequisites in place to weather the storm. But I learned my important lesson during the financial crisis because I had just taken over my first CFO assignment at SAP Germany less than 6 months before the crisis broke. And then we were faced with significant customer escalations, insolvencies of a couple of our important customers. We had raised our software maintenance fees just a few weeks, literally, before the crisis broke. And then everybody, of course, was trying to not pay the higher fees. So I had to manage through a gazillion of escalations. It was a very stressful period in time where I actually still was in the learning process of understanding what it means to have a CFO responsibility. And then on top of everything else, there was also significant significant challenges at home. In early 2009, my wife was pregnant with our third child, and 2 days before he was born, it was actually detected that she had breast cancer. So the birth had to be accelerated by 3.5 weeks in order for her to start chemotherapy treatment. So in the subsequent months, she had to undergo 8 sessions of chemotherapy, radiation therapy, 2 surgeries, all of that with us trying to juggle with then 3 kids, including a newborn, while I was managing constant escalations at work. And on top of everything else, we had just started to build a house where I had to organize and coordinate the builders and what have you. So it was really, really a horrible period of time. The Queen would have said an annus horribilis for me in 2009. But I learned a couple of important lessons during that time. One was we have to brutally prioritize during a period of crisis, separating, what is less important right now from what is really crucial and essential. Organize your day accordingly. I was then also putting more reliance for the daily operational routines on my leadership team. They were anyway probably much better at that than I could have ever been, and they were very supportive and helpful and took a lot of these daily loads off my shoulders so that I could really concentrate on the job, on the most significant things to be focused on and turned around, and while at the same time having at least enough bandwidth to support my wife, especially during those very tough days right after chemotherapy, where obviously you're incredibly weak and you have to recover. So I took care of the newborn then during that time. It was very stressful, but it also taught me the lesson that we are all much more resilient than we like to think. During a BAU situation where you're sometimes worn down even by the normal weight of your daily routines, when you're in a crisis like this, actually, and you learn to prioritize, you also recognize that you actually have the leeway to do extraordinary work. And I have to say my boss, Werner Brandt, my predecessor as the CFO of SAP, was very supportive of me when we ultimately came out of the crisis, and my wife had luckily surmounted the illness. He told me that I should check out now for some time, take care of myself fully, and I did so. It was my first and only real break from work, but it was necessary, and I reflected on these findings, and I think ever since have probably found a better way of dissecting my work between the relevant but perhaps not so urgent and what really needs to be dealt with right away. And during a crisis, this is, I think, also an institutional capability that you need to nurture. And that I try to at least also convey to my teams that if you don't want to be completely worn down by your jobs, you have to apply an 80-20 approach to the work that you do and deal with the 20% most important things as a matter of priority.
Mm. So we're going to jump forwards in time from your position as CFO of the DACH region to your position as Group CFO at SAP, which started in 2014. Whilst you were in this position, SAP undertook many major acquisitions of some very successful tech companies. To name a few, we have Concur Technologies for 8.3 billion in 2014, Qualtrics in 2018 for 8 billion, and Taulia in January of 2022. Obviously, these were large and established companies. Concur was already NASDAQ listed from 1998 as an example. But I guess there's always the concern that through integration, you risk losing the DNA that made these companies successful. So how did you manage that risk in relation to these acquired companies? And would that approach have changed had they been startups?
Yeah, it's a good question. For me, there's never a one-size-fits-all approach to M&A integration. We learned that lesson for sure through some more difficult experiences that we had made. Generally speaking, I think if an acquisition is large and is due to that almost too large to fail, then you will have the entire organization focused on the integration, and that in itself is a certain risk mitigation that you can apply. I think we always saw the biggest risk of failure of an M&A with more the mid-sized acquisitions, let's say around the 1 billion mark or so, because these companies were not yet mature enough to develop a strong culture themselves, and when they are then fully integrated and immersed into a large and complex entity such as SAP or also today Vodafone, then there is a high risk that it essentially falls apart. So what you do is typically take a hard look at what the level of synergies is that you can leverage from a closer integration versus the risks of instabilities that might create. And that is often a function of how close the business model is to your own established ones. Our earliest acquisitions that we did at SAP, the first big one was Business Objects, actually, in 2006, 2007. I actually, on the M&A front, played a role in preparing for this decision to acquire the company. But this company's business model was exactly the same as SAP's. It was a classic on-premise company with software license, maintenance business. So it was fairly easy to integrated into SAP's mainstream structures, and we did so right away. They were acquired effective February 2007, and by mid-year they were already fully on SAP's internal systems, and by the end of the year they were not around any longer because we even dissolved the legal entities that they brought to the table. That was an extreme case, would never have worked with some of these cloud acquisitions that you have mentioned, because they came with a different DNA, with a different operating model. Concur, for example, has a very noticeable SME focus, therefore needs much more velocity and kind of hands-off digital marketing approaches than SAP with its big business focus that it had. So there, the approach that we chose, for better or worse, was actually to leave these entities more on their own and drive for go-to-market synergies by opening up our installed base and our account management for support of them, but otherwise leave them relatively on their own for the first couple of years, which I think worked reasonably well to continue the growth trajectory of those businesses. But at the same time, of course, you had then constant culture clashes in terms of trying to integrate reporting structures, harmonizing data and steering taxonomies from a financial perspective. Honestly speaking, I had constant escalations and difficult conversations with the then CEO of Concur, who was then also selected to run our entire cloud business, because there was just this misfit of expectations in terms of continued independence versus integration. So that was not ideal in the long run either. So after a number of years, there was then the decision taken to also more closely integrate those businesses, when also SAP itself had evolved to adopt more kind of cloud capabilities as it's at the core of how it runs its business. But I think the interesting piece is what we then did in the last few years, because I was then from 2020 onwards personally responsible for our two latest acquisitions, Signavio and Taulia, and we applied a similar approach to them, but with a subtle difference. Signavio, for example, from a business perspective, was following a similar logic as SAP. It's a business process management suite sold in a classic cloud subscription model. So we decided that we wanted to combine the smaller teams that at SAP had been dealing with business process management capabilities and Signavio to one co-led organization with one leader from SAP and the other one being the founder and CEO of Signavio, one being more than focused on the go-to-market integration, the guy from SAP, and the other one more on continuing the R&D innovation, and with a clear view to run it in an incubation mode build underneath the CFO and not fully and immediately integrating it into the different business lines of SAP, to give it the time, so to say, to adapt to being part of the SAP group, but also with a very clear roadmap after 2 years to then really capitalize on the synergies and move it more into the mainstream operations. And I must say this has worked very well, but also because the two co-leaders on the top, which I was chairing, were getting along with each other very well, and I think still today consider themselves as a band of brothers to then go after the cause. With Taulia, it's a different story. It's a supply chain financing platform, very different, I would say, from the traditional cloud solutions that we are offering, because you have a lot of funding partners, banks that you have to integrate. You take a very small transaction fee on each financing transaction, as opposed to a big upfront subscription contract that you're selling. So it would have been hard to get our classic sales force excited about selling this product. And it's a very sophisticated, I would say, expert-driven sales. You have to have a clue about the value of supply chain financing and how you position it versus a treasurer, versus a head of procurement, versus a CFO, and so on. And we didn't have that expertise in our classic sales organization in-house. So there the decision was actually to leave it kind of semi-separate for a longer period of time, and rather and empower the CEO of Taulia over time to expand its business model to other areas like mobile money, for example, virtual card payments, and so on, and do that like a center of expertise on behalf of the rest of SAP, and then capitalize on the account access and also the relationship with the big banks that SAP, of course, could bring to the table to expand the funding pool and the set of go-to-market partners among financial institutions that Taulia could rely on. I think both has worked quite well. There's actually been in both entities very limited attrition as a result of this integration approach, and we have retained quite a lot of the talent that was in place in both entities. And that to me is, I think, kind of a best practice that I would certainly look to employ also at Vodafone if we ever make it to acquire actively new businesses. Again, especially when they are not kind of so much in line with the core business that we are driving.
And just on that topic of acquisition, integration, and innovation, I think that an important feature of many incumbent tech firms is their approach to capturing strong positions in new markets. It's something that Clayton Christensen alludes to in his 5 Laws of Organizational Nature. He describes it as giving responsibility to commercialize disruptive technology to an organization whose size matches the size of the target market. And so my question to you is, when driving innovation, whether it's disruptive or sustaining, do you see greater value in in-house R&D or divesting responsibility to venture funds, like in SAP's case, Sapphire Ventures?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think there is a third dimension as well, and that is activating an ecosystem surrounding you through partnerships and leveraging their innovation as part of a platform approach. That's super important in the software industry. Companies like Salesforce, for example, have really established themselves as a leader in their respective space, in the case of Salesforce in the CRM space, as a result of their ability to attract a plethora of independent software vendors to leveraging their platform and then exploiting their innovation as an extended innovation arm in positioning the value of the Salesforce platform itself towards its customers. Others have followed. SAP today, for example, has through its business technology platform a similar approach, but it has been a little bit late to that party. So I just wanted to stress that as a learning. It's not only about either outsourcing through venture or driving innovation organically. You can also go for a step in between and leverage strategic partnerships for that. Like Vodafone is doing it, for example, today with our partnerships with Microsoft and Google quite successfully, I have to say. But in terms of the 2 other routes, honestly speaking, you should not primarily think to leverage venture capital activities as a source of your strategic innovation, because if you do that, you inevitably create suspicion among your target subjects, because they typically want to build a big business in their own right, and they, of course, are all dreaming about floating on the stock exchange at some point. And if you build a track record that you fund some of these guys to later on actually acquire them, you might actually get question marks at the beginning of such a relationship. So I think if you go into venture capital, one of my core beliefs is you should initially do so with a true VC bias for, building great companies for financial returns. And if you then find a sweet spot of collaboration, for example, through inviting them into your ecosystem, then great. And if that then ultimately leads in one or the other case to an acquisition, then that's a welcome side product, so to say, but it should not be the core of your of your objectives. I think for that, strategic investments in which you would typically then hold a much bigger minority position to ultimately potentially acquire the majority is then a more reasonable route, and SAP has done that on a couple of occasions in the past as well. But on the organic innovation side, I think the one thing that I very much agree with Clayton Christensen is that a company, when it becomes really large and sophisticated and complex as a result of that, is not the best place to look for a constant flow of disruptive innovation. There's just the innovator's dilemma that he has been talking about at work. You are so good at the main thing that you're driving that you will always gravitate in your management attention, in the assignment of your best talent towards the incremental expansion of this position, and disruptive approaches will more often than not be crowded out, so to say, and under-invested as a result of that. That's just a reality. It's no wonder that, for example, the last bigger disruptive innovation at SAP, the invention of the in-memory database technology called HANA, has actually not been entirely driven inside SAP, but went back to an idea that SAP's former chairman and founder, Hasso Plattner, had developed with his students at his private university, the Hasso Plattner Institute. And then actually, when it was developed enough, involved SAP to further build it out and scale it. I think these types of approaches in working with academia, for example, with innovation institutes, in a partnership model that involves insourcing an idea at the point of having reached an MVP state or so, that is promising, that can actually work. But otherwise, you really need to employ a broader approach towards adopting innovation. And there's nothing bad about that, by the way, because a large company like SAP can, of course, offer a lot to smaller companies in kind of offering a platform from which they can scale effectively. And that's happening, of course, elsewhere as well. Just think about how Microsoft is now helping OpenAI to proliferate their Gen AI technology. It's called Microsoft Copilot, but of course, we all know that it's OpenAI, and I think Satya was foresightful enough to invest into OpenAI at an early point in time with significant monies, and then secure the right to distribute their technology. That's a very good example, and Microsoft is probably doing innovation better than quite a few other large firms like that, and still they have, I would say, resorted to this approach. So I think that's how leaders should think about leveraging their companies. But we should resist the temptation to think that we are really failing at remaining innovative if we don't bring out a disruptive technology innovation ourselves in a large company every 2 or 3 years. I think that's just humanly almost impossible to do, as the forces of scale drag you down almost inevitably from remaining nimble and disruptive in your thinking. And that is just something that you should probably accept and not see as a failure.
So you mentioned Hasso Plattner earlier on. He's one of the five founders of SAP and acted as CEO until 2003 and then chairman of the supervisory board until early 2024. What have you found to be the differences between a founder-led company and a non-founder-led company?
Yeah. Well, even at SAP, we transitioned from being founder-led. When I joined, there was actually even the two founders still around with Dietmar and Hasso to a management-led company. I would say in the founder-led times, it was certainly a very dynamic, but also a bit chaotic environment. Like, for example, all of the founders. It was not only Dietmar and Hasso, there was also Klaus Tschira around for a long time at SAP. And they almost all had their own little SAP inside SAP, because they all felt the need to be kind of, a brotherhood of equals. And so therefore, everyone had responsibility for some part of the engineering capacity, but then also some go-to-market responsibilities for a certain region and some parts of other corporate processes, like for example, Dietmar Hopp typically had the finance responsibility. So the CFO of SAP in those early days, when it was not yet a board position, was reporting to him, and then later on to Henning Kagermann, who was the first non-founder manager who was brought in as part of the executive board, and then became for quite some time the CEO of the company as the first manager, so to say, outside of the founders. So it was not necessarily the most efficient setup that we had back then, but obviously these guys had, formed SAP out of nothing to already then a company that was listed both in Frankfurt and in New York, and was a clear market leader in ERP. And they had, especially Hasso, constantly had these disruptive ideas, and they were really essentially his and the ideas of a small group of really top architects that he had assembled around him to work with him on flip charts and what have you. He was a guy, I think, that for a long time was even reading code still as a pleasure, as a leisure activity over the weekend. And you don't have this, of course, when you're a management-led company. What you get is, of course, typically more structure in your processes. And that's what we had as well. We had things like portfolio management in order to effectively steer the distribution of resources. SAP developed more and more into a more value chain oriented company, into a more global company in its structures, which would have never happened as long as the founders were around, because that would have gone against their little kingdoms inside the kingdom approach, so to say, that they had taken. And I think as you become larger and more global in your processes, there's also value in some of these processes that probably Hasso would more have seen as a red tape approach to things and planning, but that at the end of the day, if you find the right balance, can also make you more effective. I would say it's a mixed bag. The other thing that I think you run a risk at if you centric time frame is that because the founders are so powerful figures, they create their own followership, and sometimes it might not be always the most objective decision behind who gets into which position and who's able to drive which program. It's more often than not, and also based on a certain bias, because you will never have the position of power as a normal manager, even if you're an executive board level leader. There's always going to be some governance, some process surrounding it that will make it harder, I would say, to develop and then also execute on a stronger bias. When you're a founder and essentially you own the place, right, then that risk certainly is more prevalent. But I have to say, it's at the end of the day always a question of how the people, whether they are employed managers or founders, are really exercising their role, what kind of impact and implication this will have on their surrounding. And I think in software in particular, many founders have actually managed to, during this transition, kind of relinquish power only gradually, and yet at the same time continue to provide their disruptive capabilities to the firm. If you think about it, I mean, when Steve Jobs left and then sadly passed away soon thereafter, I mean, he had essentially not only resurfaced Apple as a leader, but made it a global market leader, which was, of course, already led operationally by Tim Cook and others in the group, but still influenced by his kind of way of thinking about innovation. Same, I hate to say it, with Oracle, even though they were, of course, the arch enemy of SAP. I think without Larry Ellison staying on as a chairman and influencing direction, especially on the technology front, I don't think that they would have made it into such a dominant position as they have it today in the database space and in other areas. And the same, of course, is true for Hasso as well. So I think it's possible to combine the two. But the important feature of the founder in all of that is to also recognize when to start to gradually pull back. That's probably the hardest call that these guys have to make.
And on the flip side of that coin, with non-founder-led companies, in 2023, after 27 years at SAP, you joined Vodafone as the CFO. What was that transition like for you?
It was very interesting because surprisingly, while the company culture and especially the qualities of the people in both companies are very similar, I have to say, the structures and the actual approaches to solving business challenges are very different. I think that's a function also of the different industries, honestly speaking. So what was surprisingly similar, certainly that in both companies you have a very strong sense of belonging of a large share of employees to the firm. They love the brand. At SAP, everybody is bleeding blue. At Vodafone, everybody is bleeding red. The speech mark here is an icon that everybody is almost worshipping on a daily basis. And despite the fact that the company has been going through tremendous hardship and transformation the last few years, people are incredibly committed to the cause, and that's a great quality on which we can, of course, further build. And the same was true at SAP. There is, I would say, also a culture that is grounded typically in respect and collaboration, perhaps sometimes even too much so, honestly speaking, because I find it a bit tough in both places, sometimes to have the tough conversations and call a spade, and also sometimes just take a top-down decision. There's a very strong interest in both companies to debate the dialogue collaboratively and democratize a lot of decision making, which sometimes can slow you down. So that's actually quite similar, perhaps even slightly more extreme at Vodafone than at SAP. But elsewhere, a lot of things are very different. And that has certainly been an interesting learning experience, but also a challenge for me. From the purest finance perspective, of course, SAP has a very complex P&L and a very simple balance sheet. Vodafone has a very complex balance sheet and a very simple P&L. So there are different things that you need to focus on. As a CFO, capital allocation is a huge challenge and issue in the telco industry, just because it's an infrastructure business that requires a lot of capital-intensive investments. And you constantly juggle between the strength of your balance sheet, your leverage ratios, the need to invest from a capex perspective. And then, of course, you have investors that, because the growth is not as spectacular as it is in the software industry, of course, have a stronger focus on keeping the companies on a tight leash and demanding constant capital returns, given that the long-term fantasy, so to say, for growth is not at the same level. Whereas in software, you have more, I would say, long-only investors still around that actually will give you the benefit of doubt, because they know that in the long run, in software, it's a scale game, and you will run for higher profitability and margins in the long run if you, in the short term, really maximize the grab of market shares and create competitive moat as a result of establishing a broader customer base, as we have seen at SAP as well in the 2000s, how important that was in a period of crisis. So there are different dynamics at play here. I have to also say, in terms of the structures, software is a business that you can and should lead in a global operating model, because the products that you're selling typically have a relatively low regulatory set of constraints. Of course, there are exceptions, like if you do supply chain financing, you're getting into banking regulatory things. That's a different story. But I would say in core ERP, you have relatively limited regulatory guardrails, so to say, that would require a country-specific approach to how you build products. You can actually do that quite well. And your customers are typically, in the case of SAP as well, global enterprises that actually want to use the products to drive consistent end-to-end processes across the globe. And therefore, the company's structure has, of course, evolved progressively to cater to that. Therefore, you have a global value chain organization. If I go here to my colleagues, former colleagues at SAP UK, then I will find them in an office, but not necessarily in an integrated legal entity, because they are all rolling up to different global leaders in different spaces, all the way from being a compliance officer locally and then reporting to a global chief compliance officer, who then reports to the global CEO, to the CFOs, to the HR people. They all report to global leaders. It's the exact opposite at Vodafone. And that's, again, due to the very distinctive local nature of the business in telco. You have a lot of regulatory constraints. The local countries, governments, of course, recognize that it's critical national infrastructure. So they will not allow the sharing of network capabilities across borders, even in the EU. That's not the case today. So you have at the core, at the end of the day, a local operation. You have very different consumers as well. In B2B, it's different. We have an enterprise business arm where you have more consistency across the customer base, similar to SAP as well. But it's a smaller part of the business, about 30% of our revenues. 70% is the consumer business. And I can tell you the consumer demands in Germany, the UK versus in Italy or in Albania are totally different. Some are way more focused on pricing. Some are more focused on quality operations. As a result, the average revenue per users is totally different in Italy versus Germany versus the UK. So also the marketing approaches towards how you position your products, how you do commercial trading are very different. And as a result, the operating model in countries is more local in nature. You have a local CEO who directs all of the resources. And therefore, there's also this constant need for alignment between those local markets and the group on anything that we want to drive in terms of common approaches and common processes. In other words, it's a constant negotiation. It takes a lot of time. What I don't like is, of course, process and system landscapes as a result of that are far more heterogeneous than they used to be back at SAP, where we were always able to follow a principle of one single system for everything that covers this respective process. Those are some of the main differences. What I'm trying to do here is now kind of blend those experiences a bit and bring in my views, still a little bit tainted from the outside, perhaps, to advocate in those areas that I don't consider part of the core of our operations, but more context surrounding supporting capabilities, to there at least adopt standardization and simplification and consolidation as much as possible, because we have no money to waste. And oftentimes this is one of the means to save money and become more efficient, to then be able to invest even more into the core. So that's one of my main thrusts here now, since I've landed with Vodafone. But suffice it to say, I think in an industry like telco, the role of the CFO and the finance function is probably even more relevant and important than in the software industry, where cash flow is almost seen as something that is sent from heaven and does not require a lot of additional effort, which is also not true, but that's the traditional wisdom sometimes in the companies. Here in telco, everybody is acutely aware how important it is really to optimize the cash flow performance, focus on your working capital performance, because the more efficient you become in your cash conversion, the better you are able to also invest in capex to provide a better customer experience and better coverage, which then gives you competitive strength again. And without finance steering this in the right manner, there would be certainly shortfalls. So I think in terms of the relevance that I don't have an easier life here, that's for sure, rather the opposite. But I at least have a feeling that there's more that I can do to influence the performance of the company, and that's actually a very, very fulfilling experience to make, and has certainly kept me excited since I started here.
So can we talk about the growth strategy of Vodafone? Because clearly Vodafone is maintaining its focus within the European market. In December, your merger with Three was approved by the CMA. Congratulations. And then in a different arena entirely, you personally opened a pan-European logistics hub in Luxembourg. But you've also divested from Indus Towers, and you continue to show a strong and growing presence in Africa through various vehicles. Given these diverse moves across geographies, how does Vodafone prioritize and balance mature markets with high growth regions? And how do you ensure this approach maintains a unified vision for Vodafone's global operations?
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's important to come back to the previous theme that telco is a local business. In order to be successful in telco, you need to operate in a market that has a reasonable market structure. So not too many convoluted players that at the end of the day, therefore fragment the available customer base. And then you have to also have an asset in that market that is operating at a sufficient scale. That's exactly the reason why we are pursuing the merger in the UK with Three, because so far we were the number 3 and number 4 players in the market, and we were quite distant from a market share perspective from BTE and VMO2. And as a result of that, we saw no line of sight of earning our cost of capital in such a fragmented scenario, where you not only have those network operators, but also a bunch of so-called MVNOs, so the Skies and Tescos of this world, obviously entering the market more on the volume side with typically steep discounts and lower price levels than the network operators themselves. So you have to look for scale in order to operate, and that holds for mature markets as well as for emerging markets. If you, in a general rule of thumb is in telco, I would say if you're operating at a market share below 20%, you are in a tough spot. And then the only difference is, of course, when you are in an emerging market, you will have more growth still on the telco side, because the penetration and saturation with smartphones and so on is at a different level. The other difference is that unlike in Europe, where data consumption has become so much of a commodity that everybody is essentially expecting, at least for the higher value bands of the offerings, that data is unlimited and is just included in a mobile or a fixed broadband plan. That is not the case in the emerging markets. There you can typically monetize the data growth separately, and that gives you, of course, a different lever to at the end of the day optimize your monetization by introducing app ecosystems, for example, through your own stores that will stimulate additional data consumption through your devices. Some of these emerging markets have quite bespoke regulatory restrictions that avoid business models like, for example, the hyperscalers in the cloud to be as effective in country. Turkey would be a good example. They have local data residency laws that don't allow enterprises to transport their data outside of the country, and therefore the telcos in the country have built a very decent business by operating as a data center and hosting provider. That would not be an opportunity that would be open to us here in Europe, but it's a quite nice augment and add-on to the classic connectivity business model. And then finally, in Africa, I think we have really taken great advantage of the lack of a traditional banking ecosystem for a large part of the population by developing a financial services platform called M-Pesa, or Vodafone Cash or VodaPay in Egypt, respectively in South Africa. It's kind of the Alipay of Africa, with meanwhile more than 80 million customers and huge transaction volumes, more than $1 billion on a daily basis going through the platform. And so we are a significant contributor to providing banking services to the unbanked on the continent, which is again a monetization opportunity that probably in Europe, with all of the Revoluts and the Stripes and what have you, would not have been available to us. I think it's therefore very important to understand that in both markets, mature or emerging, the foundation needs to be that you operate an asset with significant enough scale, and then you have different add-on capabilities. In the mature markets, at the end of the day, you need to go for efficiency. You need to reduce your churn as much as possible because you're not adding so many gross additional customers. And therefore you need to really be good in customer experience management and churn reduction, deep detractor reduction, in order to keep your base as stable as possible. Whereas in the emerging markets, it's still more about adding new capabilities and of course riding the wave of increasing smartphone penetration in those countries that then gives rise to additional data monetization opportunities, because you don't have yet the unlimited plans that you know from Europe in those countries.
So to change the topic slightly from growth through expansion to growth through innovation, Margherita Della Valle, the CEO of Vodafone, spoke of your expertise in tech and AI and the benefits of bringing in someone with a more direct experience of these developments to Vodafone. You've already led Vodafone through an extensive upgrading to SAP's ERP solution, S/4HANA, but what are the more disruptive technological innovations that Vodafone is focused on exploring at the moment?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as with everybody else, there's a huge focus on Gen AI at the moment. The nice thing about Gen AI is that, at least in our industry, you can really closely weave it into your core business processes. So, of course, we have use cases like everybody else in the more administrative internal processes, but the biggest cases are actually around how can we totally transform the customer experience. Like, for example, we're currently rolling out a Gen AI-enabled upgraded version of our much beloved chatbot called Toby, which in the past, unfortunately, based on traditional measures, has had only a first-time call resolution rate of, let's say, around 60%. We have seen now through the first use cases and scenarios being upgraded based on Gen AI. We are working with Microsoft in that particular space that we can actually bring those up to 90% or above. And that is a significant lessening of the load on our customer call centers as a consequence. Of course, it's also a better customer experience if you get things resolved without having to dial into a call center in the first place. And of course, also helps to lower costs for Vodafone. So I think I'm very bullish about these use cases. There are others in the network space as well, like, for example, automated congestion management. When you have too many people operating in a cell, then you have to reapply your your volume, so to say, as part of the network, active network management. Those are big data scenarios. And in order to react in real time, of course, you should actually and can harvest AI capabilities to help you in hyper automating these processes. So in this space, there will be huge evolutions and developments over the course, not only of the next 3 to 5 years, but it's happening actually right now already. So that's a big movement. Otherwise, certainly as we are rolling out 5G standalone, you have in the core business the ability to go after new scenarios. For example, network slicing, which was not possible before, where you can actually offer certain dedicated slices of the network with a corresponding great customer experience in terms of speed and in terms of reliability of connection to certain use cases. And you can charge actually then a premium for those, either towards the guys who are offering those services or to the consumer. So this is at the beginning, but with the increasing rollout of 5G standalone, that's an area in which you can certainly expect things to develop in the telco industry and also for us. The other big thing is satellite connectivity, certainly in everybody's mind since the rise of Elon Musk with Starlink, and while this is so far an offering that is more relevant in the broadband space, couple of players, including also one startup called AST, in which Vodafone is invested, are now racing to develop direct-to-mobile satellite capabilities. So you can use your standard Pixel or iPhone or Samsung phone to receive real voice calls via satellite without using a satellite phone that, of course, nobody owns. So this can have, also including the UK, significant benefits. Just think about the rural areas in northern Scotland or on the Scottish Islands where you have really close to no connectivity. And with a satellite, you could easily provide coverage for those. So there's a big rush to as good as possible coverage in the skies happening here. And this is an important consideration for us because the players in the skies have different business models, and some are more friendly towards telco operators, some perhaps are a little bit more difficult. And of course, we want, in a world in which perhaps in the future more connectivity services will come via satellite, we want to make sure that we still have a viable business model. That's why we actively participate, of course, in the establishment of those satellite-driven connectivity capabilities.
So I think there's something to be said from an investor perspective about these disruptive tech opportunities, because companies can be correct in identifying the overall secular trend of an industry, but perhaps may overpay for the opportunity they invest in. So I think that in order to avoid such an event from taking place, there has to be a certain degree of knowing something the market doesn't, or perhaps trusting to a certain degree a sense of innate intuition. And I think that idea is applicable more broadly. And so my final question to you is, when making strategic decisions that could shape the future success of a company, how do you balance the reliance on quantitative analysis with the intuition and qualitative insights that come from experience? Specifically speaking, how do you differentiate between knowing something the market hasn't yet realized and believing in an idea the market hasn't yet embraced, especially when aiming to capitalize on first mover advantages in disruptive technologies?
Yeah, the good thing about that is that I'm not, as I said at the beginning, I'm not so stellar in maths. So I constantly, I would say, I'm resisting the temptation to go too deep and overanalyze things. But it's a little bit in the DNA, I have to admit, of probably both companies, to try to first demand a 7-year business case before then taking a decision on an investment, even though reality, of course, is always catching up latest after 12 months with any kind of multi-year business case that you're putting in place. So I would say a healthy balance is really important, and also a decision-making process that is based on diversity. I think there's nothing worse than if you have a management team that has been all rising through the ranks of, let's say, finance and business roles, and have built their careers on managing spreadsheets, and then of course inevitably taking the decisions only on that basis. I think having a diverse management team where you give voice also to the guys who are running technology, who are not perhaps responsible for customer operations, but represent the innovation functions. And if you have one disruptive thinker among those, not kind of shutting them down too early, but really listening as well. And if you can, kind of setting aside a little bit of a pot of money for some bets, on which you will never know exactly how they will turn out, but on which you're also not betting the future of the company if you just give it a run at something, I think is also important. And we're just now actually making a number of investment decisions as part of our upcoming long-range plan, where of course, we are facing a significant uncertainty on what it will actually bring. One of those big leaps of faith, for example, was to procure AI agent licenses, Copilot licenses for the entire company. That's a significant investment because that does not come cheap because of the big energy and data consumption that it means. But we have taken a leap of faith, saying, okay, we don't know exactly how much productivity this will bring in the different functions, but what we do know is that in 2-3 years from now, the capability of a workforce to work with AI will be paramount. So if we only achieve that through that 70,000 Vodafone associates will actually know how to interact with AI, how to pose the right prompts in order to get a good quality outcome, that will inevitably already establish ourselves with a better chance to then proliferate use cases around AI in our core business as well. And so we have taken that leap of faith and have invested in it, even though, of course, the business case, how much percentages of productivity this will drive, and whether it will really allow us to reduce capacity in some of the functions is largely unproven. You can't do that with every decision. Some need to be built on science, but sometimes it's also important to just sense where the world is going, and then just sticking your neck out a little bit and saying, okay, we'll go for something as long as you're not betting the entire company on it. I think sometimes gravitating towards pace and agility is certainly the right recipe, and I would say more often than not has served me well, certainly in my career as well.
Well, Luka, it looks like we've run to the end of our time. So just to wrap up, I want to say thank you so much for joining me in this discussion today. As usual, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was a pleasure, and all the best for the future of your podcast initiative.
Thank you.